They say revenge is a dish best served cold. For Aria Drake, it was a dish served in a size 6 couture gown on the most important night of her husband's life. For years she was his shadow, the plus-size wife of millionaire industrialist Julian Drake, a woman whose worth was measured in whispered jokes and cruel sidelong glances from his high society family. They laughed at her weight. They mocked her spirit. They never imagined that beneath the layers of shame they'd heaped upon her, a queen was waiting. This is the story of how one woman's pain, channeled into a singular, brilliant plan, brought an entire empire to its knees. One dress, one walk, and the man who had everything lost it all. The air in the Drake mansion was always thin scrubbed of any scent that might suggest life. It smelled of money, which Aria Drake had learned was a sterile metallic fragrance, punctuated by the faint cloying sweetness of Beatrice Drake's signature Chanel No. 5. Beatrice, her mother-in-law, was the matriarch of this cold dynasty, a woman whose spine seemed to be forged from the same steel as the family's shipping empire. Aria had been married to Julian Drake for 5 years. On paper, it was a fairy tale. A quiet librarian from a middle-class family who had captured the heart of one of New York's most formidable bachelors. The reality was a gilded cage, and the bars were forged from her own insecurities, hammered into place each day by Julian and his family. Her crime in their eyes was simple. She was not one of them. She was not thin. She was not cruel. And she did not possess the effortless, predatory grace of the women in their circle. Julian had discovered her during a brief, rebellious phase, charmed by what he called her earthy authenticity. That charm had curdled into contempt within the first 6 months of their marriage. Now her body was his favorite battlefield. Aria darling. Julian's voice, smooth as silk and just as suffocating, slithered into the master closet. It was a room the size of her childhood apartment, lined with glass-fronted cabinets, displaying his tailored suits and her collection of appropriate, that is, loose-fitting and dark-colored dresses. She was struggling with a zipper, her breath catching in her throat. The dress was a deep emerald green, a beautiful color she would have loved had it not been a trap. Julian had bought it for her for his parents' 40th anniversary dinner. He'd presented it to her with a flourish, a kiss on the cheek that felt more like a brand. A little something to inspire you, he'd murmured. He knew her size. He knew this dress was at least 2 sizes too small. He appeared behind her in the mirror, already immaculate in a Tom Ford tuxedo. His handsome face, the one that graced the covers of business magazines, was tightened into a familiar mask of impatience. Still at it. "We're going to be late. My parents detest tardiness. It's a bit snug." "Julian," Aria said, her voice small. Humiliation was a hot flush creeping up her neck. He sighed, a theatrical sound of long suffering. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip just a little too tight. His eyes met hers in the mirror, and they were cold, devoid of the affection he performed for cameras. "Snug, Aria. It's a dress, not a corset. Perhaps if you'd shown a little more discipline after that trip to Italy." He was referring to a vacation 2 months prior. The only 2 weeks in the last year. She'd felt a sliver of happiness enjoying pasta without a running calorie count in her head. He had punished her for it ever since. "I've been careful," she whispered, a futile defense. "Clearly not careful enough," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a secret rather than delivering an insult. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping over her struggling form in the mirror. You know, my mother was just saying the other day how she worries about your health. The Drake name carries a certain image, Arya. People look at you, and they see me. They see our family. What do you think they see right now? They saw a woman trapped. A woman whose spirit was being slowly, methodically crushed. He gestured dismissively. Fine. Wear the black sack you always wear. Just try to stand behind Clara in the photos. Her thinness is very flattering to others. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Clara Julian's younger sister was a wraith-like creature who seemed to subsist on champagne and resentment. She had made Arya the butt of her jokes from the day they met. Arya felt the familiar sting of tears, but refused to let them fall. Crying only ever seemed to amuse him. She peeled off the beautiful green trap and pulled on a shapeless black dress, the fabric feeling like a shroud. As she fastened a simple pearl necklace, a gift from her own mother, her hands trembled. The anniversary dinner was held at the Four Seasons, in a private room dripping with crystal and old money. The entire Drake clan was there, along with their inner circle of bankers, politicians, and socialites. Arya felt like a clumsy pigeon that had wandered into an aviary of peacocks. Beatrice greeted her with a kiss that didn't land, her perfectly painted lips puckering an inch from Arya's cheek. Arya, dear, that dress is certainly a choice. Very slimming. The compliment was a perfectly aimed dart. Happy anniversary, Beatrice. You look stunning, Arya said, her voice practiced and polite. Thank you, dear. 40 years with Alistair. It takes work. And maintenance. Beatrice's eyes did a quick, critical scan of Arya's body, from head to toe. The message was clear. Arya was failing at maintenance. Dinner was an agonizing ballet of veiled insults. Every conversation seemed to circle back to discipline, appearance, and legacy. I just read about the benefits of intermittent fasting, Clara announced to the table, her bright, malicious eyes flicking to Arya. It's simply incredible for one's physique. You basically just stop eating. So simple. Some people just don't have the willpower, I suppose. A few people chuckled. Julian placed a proprietary hand on Arya's, squeezing it, as if to say, Smile. Don't you dare make a scene. She smiled. It felt like her face was cracking. She took a sip of water, her plate of exquisitely prepared sea bass untouched. She knew if she ate it, there would be a comment. If she didn't, there would be a different comment. There was no winning move. The true nightmare began with the cake. It was a magnificent, multi-tiered creation, a testament to the family's wealth and endurance. After the ceremonial cutting, the waiters began serving slices. When a waiter approached Arya, Julian held up a hand. "Oh, none for my Arya," he said, his voice booming with false joviality. "She's on a rather strict health regimen. Aren't you, darling?" The table fell silent. Every eye turned to her. It was a public shaming orchestrated by her husband. He was showcasing his control, his disappointment, all under the guise of caring for her well-being. "Just a small piece," Arya said, trying to keep her voice even. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Nonsense." Beatrice cut in her tone like chipping ice. "Julian is right. A moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. And you have so much potential, dear. It would be a shame to waste it." The phrase hung in the air, so much potential. It was what they'd been saying for 5 years. It meant you are not good enough as you are. Clara twisted the knife. She leaned forward, a conspiratorial smirk on her face. "Besides, we can't have you splitting the seams of that lovely new dress Julian bought you, can we? The green one. He told me all about it. Such a shame it didn't accommodate." The laughter was quiet at first, a few titters. Then, fueled by champagne and casual cruelty, it grew. It was a wave of sound that washed over Arya, drowning her. She looked at Julian, pleading with her eyes. He just smiled, a thin, satisfied smile, and squeezed her hand again. He was enjoying this. This was the point. She felt a strange sort of detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching this poor, sad woman be dismantled for sport. She saw the smirks, the pitying looks, the undisguised contempt. She looked at the faces of the most powerful people in the city, and she saw nothing but ugliness. She excused herself from the table, her movements stiff. No one tried to stop her. As she walked toward the restroom, she could feel their eyes on her back. Her safe black dress suddenly feeling like a spotlight. In the cool marble sanctuary of the ladies' room, she gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her eyes were dull, her face puffy from unshed tears. She had been so busy trying to be the woman they wanted, she had forgotten the woman she actually was. The girl who loved books, who had a quick wit, who felt things deeply. They had tried to starve her not just of food, but of her very self. A new feeling, cold and hard, began to form in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't shame. It was rage. A pure, clarifying rage. They thought this was a game. They thought they could break her. They laughed at her weight, at her dress, at her very existence. Standing there under the unforgiving lights of the most expensive restaurant in the city, Arya Drake made a silent vow. They wanted to see a transformation. She would give them one. They wanted to talk about discipline. They hadn't seen anything yet. They thought her weight was her weakness. She would make it her armor. They thought her silence was submission. It would become her weapon. They had laughed their last laugh at her expense. The next time she walked into a room like this, they wouldn't be laughing. They would be ruined. The war had been declared, and they had no idea she was about to start fighting back. The days following the anniversary dinner were a blur of calculated obedience. On the surface, nothing had changed. Arya remained the quiet, accommodating wife. She smiled when Julian made his little jokes. She nodded when Beatrice gave her unsolicited advice on diet and deportment, and she endured Clara's venomous barbs with the same pained stoicism. But behind her carefully guarded eyes, a revolution was taking place. The rage she'd felt in the marble restroom had not dissipated. It had crystallized into a diamond-hard core of purpose. Her first move was small, almost laughably so. She started walking. Every morning before Julian or any of the staff were awake, she would slip out of the mansion and walk through the manicured sleeping streets of their wealthy enclave. At first it was a struggle. Her body, neglected and burdened by stress, protested. But she pushed through the pain, her mantra a silent, rhythmic chant of their names: Julian, Beatrice, Clara. Each step was a tiny rebellion. She didn't join a fancy gym. That would be too noticeable. Julian would either mock it as another failed attempt or try to co-opt it, hiring a celebrity trainer to better mold her into his ideal. Her transformation had to be entirely her own, forged in secret. She found a small, gritty boxing gym in a less fashionable part of town, a place that smelled of sweat and effort, not money. She paid in cash. Her trainer, a grizzled ex-fighter named Sal, didn't care about her last name. He only cared about her right hook. "You got a lot of anger in you," he'd grunted after their first session, as she gasped for breath, her knuckles raw. "Is that a bad thing?" she'd asked. Sal had grinned, a flash of gold in his mouth. "In here, it's fuel." The physical exertion was a release, but Arya knew that a toned body alone wouldn't win this war. Julian's power wasn't in his physique. It was in his fortune, his connections, his name. She needed to understand the architecture of his empire before she could figure out how to demolish it. She began to listen. Truly listen. For 5 years, she had tuned out the endless talk of mergers, acquisitions, and stock portfolios. It was Julian's world, a world she had been made to feel too stupid to enter. Now she absorbed every word. At dinner parties, while the other wives discussed florists and vacation spots, Arya would position herself near the men, her expression one of mild wifely disinterest, while she mentally recorded every mention of a holding company, every whispered rumor about a competitor, every boast about a regulatory loophole. Her status as the dim-witted plus-size wife was the perfect camouflage. No one noticed her. No one suspected she was anything more than a decorative piece of furniture. Julian would often take business calls in front of her, speaking in clipped, arrogant tones, utterly confident in her inability to comprehend the intricacies of his dealings. He was discussing a hostile takeover of a smaller tech firm, a company called Innovate Dynamics, run by a man named David Chen. Julian spoke of Chen with utter derision, calling him a naive idealist who was about to get a lesson in the real world. Arya filed the name away. Her next step was to find an ally. She couldn't do this alone. She remembered a name from years ago before Julian. Marcus Thorne. He was a cousin of a college friend, a quiet, intensely sharp financial advisor who had left a major Wall Street firm to start his own boutique consultancy. The official story was that he was tired of the corporate grind. The rumor was that he'd been pushed out for having too much integrity. He was perfect. Finding him was easy. Contacting him was a risk. She used a pay-as-you-go burner phone and a new email address created at the public library 2 towns over. She requested a consultation under a false name, Ms. Evelyn Hayes, citing a need for advice on a complex inheritance. Their first meeting was in a nondescript coffee shop, in a neighborhood Julian would never dream of visiting. Marcus Thorne was exactly as she remembered, unassuming with intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was dressed in a simple, well-worn tweed jacket, a stark contrast to the slick armor of Julian's associates. "Ms. Hayes." He began, his voice calm and professional. "You mentioned a complex inheritance." Arya took a deep breath. That was a lie. "My name is Arya Drake." Marcus's eyebrows shot up, the only sign of his surprise. He knew the name, of course. Everyone knew the Drake name. "My husband is Julian Drake," she continued, her voice steady. "And I need your help to discreetly understand his finances. All of them. The ones he shows the world and the ones he doesn't." Marcus leaned back, studying her. The silence stretched. Arya's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. She had expected him to refuse to show her the door. Dealing with Julian Drake was a dangerous game. Why, he finally asked. It was the most important question. Arya didn't tell him about the humiliation, the years of quiet suffering. He wouldn't be moved by a sob story. He was a man who dealt in facts and figures. So she gave him facts. "I believe my husband is engaged in practices that are not just unethical, but potentially illegal. He uses shell corporations to hide assets. He engages in predatory acquisitions to strip companies of their IP and then bankrupts them. He treats people like they are disposable commodities. I was one such acquisition, and I am no longer willing to be a party to it. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, respect. This is a significant risk, Mrs. Drake, he said slowly. For both of us. If Julian found out... He won't, Arya said, a certainty in her voice that surprised even herself. Because he doesn't see me. To him, I am a foolish, overweight woman who is interested in garden parties and charity luncheons. He has no idea who I am. That is my greatest advantage. Marcus was silent for another long moment, tapping a pen against his notepad. Then he gave a slight, decisive nod. Okay, Arya Drake. Where do we begin? That was the day the silent architect found her master builder. Their work was meticulous and clandestine. Arya became a sponge. Marcus would give her concepts to study leveraged buyouts, offshore accounts, derivatives trading, and she would devour the information in the mansion's vast unused library, a place no one ever thought to look for her. She learned to read financial statements to trace money through labyrinthine corporate structures. She used her invisibility to her advantage. While Julian was at the office, she would go into his home study. He was arrogant, so his security was lax. His main password was the name of his first polo pony, Triumph. It was pathetically predictable. She never moved a thing. She used her phone to photograph documents, balance sheets, and private ledgers, uploading them to a secure encrypted cloud server that Marcus had set up. She discovered the depth of his deceit was far greater than she had imagined. He was using a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands to undervalue his assets and evade millions in taxes. He had a slush fund for corporate espionage, paying informants to gather dirt on his rivals. And the takeover of Innovate Dynamics, the company run by David Chen, was particularly ugly. Julian wasn't just trying to acquire it. He was actively sabotaging it, planting false rumors to drive the stock price down so he could buy it for pennies on the dollar. The information was a weapon, and Marcus taught her how to sharpen it. Information is only powerful if you know when and how to deploy it, he explained during one of their secret coffee shop meetings. Dumping it all at once creates chaos, but it might not achieve your objective. You need to think like a military strategist. A small, targeted strike can cause a cascade of failures. He pointed her toward a key vulnerability. Julian's entire empire was built on a foundation of debt, leveraged against the perceived value of his publicly traded company, Drake Industries. His reputation was his currency. If that reputation were to be publicly and irrevocably shattered, the banks that held his loans would get nervous. The shareholders would panic. The house of cards would collapse. Arya's personal transformation continued in parallel. The pounds she shed from boxing and walking were replaced by muscle and a steely confidence. Her mind, once fogged by depression and shame, was now sharp and clear. For the first time, she was eating not to fill a void, but to fuel her body for the fight ahead. She started buying her own clothes, simple, elegant, well-fitting pieces, and keeping them at a small storage unit she'd rented. Julian barely noticed. Or if he did, he attributed it to his own brilliant influence. "See," he said one evening, looking her over with a critical but slightly more approving eye. "I told you a little discipline would do you wonders. You're almost there." Almost there. She thought, a cold smile playing on her lips. He had no idea where she was going. Her final piece of preparation was personal. Years ago, in a rare moment of what he'd probably considered generosity, Julian had gifted her a small portfolio of stocks for their first anniversary. It was a pittance to him, a token gesture he'd long forgotten about. Aria, under Marcus's guidance, had quietly liquidated it months ago. The sum, combined with some family jewelry she'd sold, wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was her escape fund, her beginning. She made one more clandestine trip this time to a lawyer Marcus had recommended, a fierce, brilliant woman named Anita Singh, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. Aria sat in her office and laid out the entire story, supported by a folder of damning financial documents. Anita listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Aria was finished, she leaned forward. "Mrs. Drake," she said, "most women in your position come in here asking for a settlement. They want the house, the alimony, a piece of the pie. You seem to be asking for a blowtorch. I don't want his money." "Ms. Singh," Aria said, her voice ringing with clarity, "I want him to understand what it feels like to have everything you've built your identity on turn to ash. I want justice for every person he has stepped on to get to the top. The divorce is just the closing chapter. I'm writing the rest of the book myself." Anita Singh smiled a slow, predatory smile that reminded Aria of a panther. "I like your style, Mrs. Drake. Let's get to work." The plan was set. The players were in position. The target was oblivious, cocooned in his own arrogance. All she needed was the perfect stage for the final act. And she knew exactly where it would be: the Drake Annual Charity Gala. The glittering centerpiece of the New York social calendar. The very event where a year from now, Julian planned to be celebrated as a king. He had no idea he was attending his own execution. The months leading up to the Drake Annual Charity Gala were a masterclass in psychological warfare, with only one side aware a war was even being fought. Aria moved through the Drake mansion like a ghost, her presence both constant and completely overlooked. She played the part of the slowly improving wife to perfection. She was quieter, more agreeable, and as Julian often remarked to his mother, finally making an effort. He saw her weight loss not as a sign of her own strength, but as a victory for his persistent campaign of criticism. "You see, Beatrice?" All it took was a firm hand, he'd say smugly over the phone, while Aria was in the next room, cross-referencing shipping manifests with a list of his Cayman Islands shell companies. Her mind had become a fortress. Marcus Thorne had taught her not just about finance, but about compartmentalization. When she was with Julian, she was that Aria, the timid, slightly dim woman he had married. She would ask him simple questions about his day, her eyes wide with a carefully feigned lack of comprehension. "Oh, that sounds so complicated," she'd say when he mentioned a particularly brutal negotiation. His ego, a vast and hungry beast, devoured to the praise. It never occurred to him that her simple questions were strategically designed to confirm details she and Marcus had already flagged as suspicious. Her greatest weapon was the home office. It was Julian's sanctuary, a mahogany-paneled shrine to his own success. He believed it was impregnable. But Aria had discovered his blind spot, his absolute faith in his own superiority. He would leave his laptop unlocked for minutes at a time, striding out of the room to bellow at a staff member or take a call on the terrace. In those precious, heart-pounding intervals, Aria would strike. With a USB drive no bigger than her thumbnail, she performed a digital heist in slow motion. Guided by Marcus's encrypted instructions, she copied entire directories, focusing on files labeled Project Nightingale Legacy Assets and JC Private. She didn't know what they all meant yet, but she knew They were the keys to his kingdom. She was a ghost in his machine, leaving no trace. The physical and mental transformations fed each other. In her secret boxing sessions with Sal, she learned to anticipate an opponent's moves to find their weakness and exploit it. "It ain't about power," Arya Sal would grunt, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's about timing. You wait for them to overcommit, to get arrogant. Then you strike." It was a perfect metaphor for her strategy with Julian. She applied this to her investigation into Innovate Dynamics, the tech company Julian was trying to strangle. Using the files from his laptop, she and Marcus uncovered the full extent of the sabotage. Julian had hired a firm to launch a smear campaign against the CEO David Chen, feeding tech bloggers and financial journalists anonymous, misleading tips about production failures and security vulnerabilities at the company. The stock had plummeted, just as he'd planned. Arya felt a visceral connection to this unknown man. He was being bullied, his life's work torn apart by a predator all for sport and profit. This was her fight now, too. "We can't go to the press with this yet," Marcus cautioned, looking at the mountain of evidence they had compiled. "Julian's lawyers would bury us. They'd paint you as a disgruntled wife, and me as a failed ambulance chaser. We need something undeniable, something that comes from a source so credible it can't be dismissed." The source, Arya realized, had to be internal to Drake Industries. But how she couldn't just walk into the company headquarters. The opportunity came from an unexpected place, Beatrice Drake. "Arya, dear," Beatrice had said one afternoon, cornering her by the sterile, lifeless floral arrangement in the grand foyer. "The Charity Gala Committee needs a new liaison. It's tedious work, mostly paperwork, and chasing RSVPs, but it's a vital role. And frankly, it's time you took on a more visible responsibility." It was a test, a chance for Arya to prove she was worthy of the Drake name by performing menial, thankless tasks. The old Arya would have shrunk from the scrutiny. The new Arya saw an open door. "Of course, Beatrice. I would be honored," she said, her voice a perfect blend of humility and gratitude. The role gave her a legitimate reason to be at the Drake Industries headquarters. She was given a small temporary desk in the events department, a bustling, overlooked corner of the 35th floor. The other committee members, all society wives, treated her with the same condescending politeness she was used to. They saw her as the boss's simple wife there to sign off on catering menus and approve floral arrangements. They had no idea she was conducting a reconnaissance mission. During her lunch breaks, she wouldn't go out with the other women. She would wander the halls, her official liaison badge granting her access. She memorized the layout of the executive floor, the location of the CFO's office, the server room. She observed the rhythms of the office, who left for lunch, when which assistants were loyal, and which ones complained in the break room. She found her target in the accounting department, a man named Arthur Pym. He was a senior accountant, a man in his late 50s, who had been with the company for 30 years. He was quiet, meticulous, and as Arya learned from a gossipy events coordinator, had been repeatedly passed over for promotion in favor of younger, slicker men who were part of Julian's inner circle. Arthur was old school, a man of integrity in a den of sharks. Arya didn't approach him directly. That would be too risky. Instead, she used the information she'd gathered to set a subtle trap. From Julian's private files, she knew he was using a specific subsidiary, North Star Holdings, as the primary vehicle for his tax evasion scheme. The subsidiary was funneling money to the Caymans, but it was being recorded in the company's internal books in a way that was highly irregular. It was a time bomb waiting for an auditor to find it. Using an anonymous email account and a public Wi-Fi network, Marcus sent an email to the top 4 senior partners at the firm that handled Drake Industries' official audits. The email was brief and pointed. As a concerned shareholder, I suggest a closer look at the asset transfers to North Star Holdings in Q3 and Q4 of last year. The numbers don't add up. The email didn't need to be proven, it just needed to plant a seed of doubt. A formal audit was a legal process. An informal inquiry from a nervous partner, however, was something else entirely. As they predicted, the partners didn't launch a full investigation, but they did get spooked. They sent a quiet request to the Drake Industries CFO for clarification on the North Star accounts. The CFO, a Julian loyalist named Greg, knew exactly what this was. He needed to bury it fast. And to do that, he needed someone to create a new set of falsified documents to justify the transfers. He needed a scapegoat. He gave the job to Arthur Pym. Aria watched it unfold from her perch on the charity committee. She saw the stress etched on Arthur's face. She saw him staying late, his office light glowing long after everyone else had gone home. He was a good man, being forced to do a bad thing, and it was eating him alive. Now was the time to approach him. She accidentally ran into him by the elevators one evening. "Mr. Pym." "You're working late," she said, her voice soft and concerned. He looked up, startled. He seemed surprised she even knew his name. "Mrs. Drake?" "Yes. Just deadlines." "Everything all right?" she asked, feigning innocence. "You seem terribly worried." Something in her gentle demeanor, so at odds with the brutal environment of the company, seemed to break through his reserve. He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw not the boss's wife, but a kind face. "It's nothing, Mrs. Drake. Just company business," he mumbled, looking away. "My husband Aria," said, her voice dropping, "is a very demanding man. He expects perfection no matter the cost. Sometimes the cost is people's integrity." Arthur's head snapped back toward her. His eyes widened. She had just given voice to the very thought that was destroying him. "I know what they've asked you to do with the North Star files," she said quietly, taking the ultimate risk. "And I know it's wrong. They are going to make you the fall guy when this all comes crashing down." He paled, his hand trembling as he clutched his briefcase. How could you possibly know that?" "Let's just say Julian discusses more than he realizes at home," she said, letting him fill in the blanks. "Mr. Pym, you have a choice. You can go down with him. Or you can help me ensure that the person responsible for this is the one who pays the price." She handed him a small, plain card. On it was the number for her burner phone. "You have copies of the original documents before you were asked to alter them." "I know you do. You're too meticulous to destroy a paper trail," she said. "Contact me when you're ready to do the right thing." She walked away, her heart pounding. She had just laid all her cards on the table. If Arthur went to Julian, it was all over. For 2 agonizing days, her phone remained silent. She barely slept. She went through the motions of her life, a knot of dread in her stomach. Julian was more arrogant than ever, high on the thrill of his impending Innovate Dynamics acquisition. Then on the 3rd night, the burner phone buzzed. It was an untraceable number. Mrs. Drake, a trembling voice, said, "It was Arthur Pym. I have the files, the real ones. What do you want me to do?" Relief washed over Aria, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. "Thank you, Arthur," she whispered. You just saved your own life, and you just gave me the bomb I need to blow up theirs." The final piece of the puzzle was in her hand. Now all she needed was the perfect dress. The night of the Drake annual charity gala arrived on a wave of crisp autumn air. It was the social event of the season, a night where New York's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while dripping in diamonds and cynicism. For Julian Drake, this year was to be his coronation. He had successfully crushed David Chen and was in the final stages of acquiring Innovate Dynamics for a fraction of its worth. The gala held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was his victory lap. He stood before the full-length mirror in their bedroom, adjusting his bow tie. He was a portrait of masculine power and privilege. "Aria, are you ready? The car is waiting. And for God's sake, I hope you chose something appropriate. Tonight is important. I'll be right down," her voice called from the adjoining dressing room. He sighed in exasperation and headed downstairs, assuming she was wrestling with another ill-fitting garment. In the grand foyer, Beatrice and Clara were waiting, preening like exotic birds of prey. "Is she coming?" Clara asked, a sneer playing on her lips. "Or is she planning to make a late entrance to hide in the shadows?" "Patience, dear," Beatrice said, though her own eyes were sharp with disapproval. Let's hope she remembered my advice about understated elegance. Upstairs, Aria stood before her own mirror. But the woman she saw was not the one they remembered. The room around her was not her usual dark closet, but the spare bedroom she had secretly converted into her command center. For months, she had been preparing for this single moment. The dress was her declaration of war. It was not black. It was not loose. It was a column of shimmering liquid silver, a custom creation by a designer Julian had never heard of. It clung to every curve of her new, powerful body, a body built by boxing gloves and relentless determination. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe apologetic bun, was styled in soft, glamorous waves that fell over one shoulder. Her makeup was flawless, her eyes defined and fierce. On her ears were not the simple pearls of her past, but a pair of diamond earrings she had bought herself with her own money. She looked regal. She looked dangerous. She took one last look at the laptop on the desk. A series of emails were cued, timed to send at precise intervals throughout the evening. The first from an anonymous source containing Arthur Pym's undoctored files on the North Star Holdings fraud was scheduled to be sent to a hand-picked list of financial regulators and a famously tenacious investigative journalist at the New York Times in exactly 1 hour. The second, containing proof of Julian's corporate sabotage against Innovate Dynamics, was scheduled to be sent to David Chen's legal team 90 minutes from now. Everything was in place. It was time. Her walk down the grand staircase was not a walk. It was a descent. Each step was deliberate, silent. The click of her silver heels on the marble was the only sound. The trio in the foyer heard it and looked up. Their conversation died in their throats. For a moment they didn't recognize her. They saw a stunning, confident woman, a stranger in their home. Then comprehension dawned, and their expressions shifted from confusion to utter slack-jawed shock. Clara's mouth literally fell open. Beatrice's perfectly powdered face seemed to crack. But it was Julian's face that gave Aria the most satisfaction. His smugness evaporated, replaced by a bewildering mix of disbelief, confusion, and for the first time a flicker of something she had never seen in him before: intimidation. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time. "Aria, He breathed his voice a dry rasp. What is this? She reached the bottom of the stairs and glided to a halt before him. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "It's a dress, Julian," she said, her voice cool and clear, stripped of its former fear. "You told me to wear something appropriate. I believe this is—" She turned and walked out the door without a backward glance, leaving the three of them standing frozen in her wake, like statues in a museum of their own making. The ride to the museum was silent. Julian kept stealing glances at her, his mind clearly racing, trying to process this new reality. He was off balance, and it showed. For the first time in their marriage, Arya held all the power. When they arrived, the entrance was a frenzy of flashing camera bulbs and fawning reporters. Usually Arya would shrink from the attention hiding behind Julian's broad shoulders. Tonight, she stepped out of the car first. The effect was instantaneous. A hush fell over the press line, followed by a frantic explosion of flashes and shouted questions. "Mrs. Drake, is that you? Who are you wearing? Arya, you look incredible." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She posed, turning gracefully, letting the cameras capture every angle of her triumph. Julian, for the first time in his life, was an accessory. He stood awkwardly to the side, a thunderous expression on his face usurped on his own red carpet. Inside, the reaction was magnified. As Arya entered the grand hall, conversations faltered. Heads turned. A wave of whispers followed her as she moved through the crowd. She was the center of the universe, a supernova in a room full of dying stars. Men who had never given her a second glance now stared with open admiration. Women who had whispered jokes behind her back now looked at her with a venomous mix of envy and shock. She saw Beatrice and Clara across the room, huddled together, their faces pale. They looked like refugees whose country had just been invaded. Arya ignored them all. She had one target. She spotted David Chen, the beleaguered CEO of Innovate Dynamics, standing alone by a Grecian statue, looking out of place and defeated. He was here tonight because Julian had insisted a final twist of the knife to make Chen watch him celebrate his victory. Arya glided towards him. "Mr. Chen," she said. He turned his eyes weary. "Mrs. Drake, I'm surprised you know who I am." "I know more than you think," she said, her voice low. "I know what my husband did to you and your company. And I want you to know that he's not going to get away with it." Chen stared at her, confused. "I appreciate the sentiment, but it's too late. The deal is almost done." "A lot can happen in an hour," Arya said, giving him a small, conspiratorial smile. "Check your email and tell your lawyers to stand by. Help is coming." Just then, Julian appeared at her side, his hand gripping her arm. "What are you doing talking to him?" He hissed, his public smile a brittle facade. "Networking, darling," Arya replied sweetly, pulling her arm from his grasp. "It's what one does at these things, isn't it?" She moved away, leaving the two men staring after her. The first email, she knew, had just been sent. The first domino had just been tipped. She found a strategic position on the grand balcony, overlooking the hall, a glass of champagne in her hand, and she watched. For the next 30 minutes, the party continued the buzz around her own transformation, the main topic of conversation. Julian watched her like a hawk from across the room, his fury barely contained. Then the first tremor hit. A man near the bar, a prominent hedge fund manager, looked down at his phone. His eyes went wide. He leaned over and showed it to his companion. Soon another phone was out. Then another. A low, anxious murmur began to ripple through the crowd, spreading faster than a virus. The journalist from the New York Times, a woman with a reputation for tearing down giants, was now working her phone, her face a mask of intense concentration. Julian saw it, too. His own phone buzzed. He looked at it, and the color drained from his face. He looked up, his eyes frantically, searching the room until they locked with Aria's. She simply raised her glass to him in a silent toast. That's when he knew. Panic began to set in. The CEO of the bank that held Julian's largest loans was now in a frantic, whispered conversation with his aides. People were starting to move toward the exits, their faces grim. The festive atmosphere had curdled into one of pure dread. The final blow came when David Chen's voice, now strong and clear, cut through the noise. He was on the phone, but he was speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Yes, that's right. Irrefutable proof of stock manipulation and corporate sabotage. I want to file an immediate injunction to halt the sale, and I want to press charges against Julian Drake, personally. All heads swiveled from Chen to Julian. The king was naked in his court. The victory lap had become a perp walk. He was trapped, cornered, his face a grotesque mask of rage and disbelief. His empire, built on reputation and fear, was imploding in real time, broadcast across the smartphones of every powerful person in New York. He staggered through the panicking crowd, his eyes fixed on Aria. He stumbled up to the balcony. His perfect tuxedo now rumpled his face, slick with sweat. You, he seethed, his voice a ragged whisper. This was you. Aria took a delicate sip of her champagne. She looked at the man who had tried to crush her, a man now smaller and weaker than she had ever seen him. Me, she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. No, Julian. This was all you. You just didn't realize I was the one keeping score. Down below, the first uniformed officers of the SEC's enforcement division were walking through the door. The gala was over. The reckoning had begun. The collapse was faster and more brutal than anyone could have predicted. The world Julian Drake had built was a house of cards, and Aria had pulled out the one card that mattered his reputation. The New York Times story, published online just before midnight, was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, detailing the North Star Holdings tax evasion scheme with damning, irrefutable evidence provided by a high-level internal source. By morning, the stock of Drake Industries had been suspended from trading, but not before its value had been virtually wiped out in pre-market activity. The injunction filed by David Chen's lawyers, armed with the proof of sabotage Aria had provided, stopped the acquisition of Innovate Dynamics in its tracks. Not only that, it opened the floodgates. 2 other companies Julian had conquered in the past announced they were launching legal reviews of their own takeovers. The predators were circling, and for the first time, Julian was the prey. Aria had left the gala a free woman. She didn't go back to the mansion. She went to a discreet luxury hotel suite that Marcus had booked for her under her old name, Aria Vance. She turned off her phone and slept for 10 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she'd had in 5 years. When she awoke, the world had been remade. The next few days were a media firestorm. Photos of Julian looking haggard and broken, being hounded by reporters, were plastered everywhere. The headline that gave Aria a grim sense of satisfaction was in the Daily News beside a stunning photo of her from the Gala the Drake come-down. How the plus-size wife became a Titan slayer. Anita Singh. Her lawyer handled everything. She filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and attached a motion stating that Arya was relinquishing any and all claims to Julian's assets, a move that stunned the legal community and painted her as a woman of principle, not a gold digger. It was a strategic masterstroke. She wasn't taking his money. She was leaving him to drown in his debts. The banks called in his loans. His credit lines were frozen. The lavish lifestyle, funded entirely by leverage and lies, evaporated overnight. The mansions, the private jet, the polo ponies, all were seized as collateral. Beatrice and Clara were not spared. Their fortunes were inextricably tied to Julian's. They were social pariahs, their names synonymous with fraud and disgrace. The invitations stopped coming. The friends stopped calling. Clara had a very public meltdown in Bergdorf's when her credit card was declined. It was a pitiful, ugly end to their reign of casual cruelty. A week after the gala, Arya agreed to see him. Not because he asked, but because she needed to close the chapter herself. She chose the location, a drab, anonymous meeting room in Anita Singh's law office, a neutral ground where he held no power. He looked like a stranger. The bespoke suit was gone, replaced by a rumpled off-the-rack jacket that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight, but it wasn't the healthy, vibrant transformation she had undergone. He looked gaunt, haunted. The arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate confusion. "Arya," he began, his voice raspy. "Why?" It was the same question he had asked on the balcony, but now it was not a demand, but a plea. He genuinely didn't understand. Arya sat opposite him, calm and poised. "You've had a week to think about it, Julian. Have you come up with any ideas?" "This is about the money," he guessed, shaking his head. "You wanted more. You could have just asked for a better settlement. You didn't have to burn everything to the ground." Arya almost laughed. It was so perfectly him. Even in his ruin, he believed the world revolved around money. "This was never about money," she said, her voice even. "I don't want a single dollar from you. I have my own." This was about respect, a concept you are only just beginning to understand now that you've lost it. She leaned forward. "Let me make it clear for you. Do you remember your parents' 40th anniversary dinner, when you held up my plate and announced to a table full of people that I was on a health regimen? Do you remember the sound of them laughing when Clara talked about the green dress that didn't accommodate me?" He stared at her, a flicker of memory in his eyes. He clearly remembered, but he didn't understand its significance. To him, it was a throwaway moment. To her, it was the lighting of the fuse. "You spent 5 years trying to make me smaller. Julian," she continued. "You chipped away at my confidence, you insulted my intelligence, you mocked my body. You thought my worth was something you could dictate. You tried to break my spirit. But you made a fatal miscalculation. You thought I was weak because I was kind. You thought I was stupid because I was Sun." She stood up, looking down at the broken man. "Every time you made a joke at my expense, you were handing me a stone. Every time your mother looked at me with contempt, she was handing me a stone. Every time your sister sneered at me, she was handing me a stone. I just waited. I collected them all, and I used them to build the foundation of your downfall. You didn't do this for justice for David Chen or your accountant. You did this for revenge," he whispered, his face ashen. "You're wrong," Arya said, her voice softening for the first time, not with pity, but with a profound finality. "Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. What I did was calculated. It was a rebalancing of the scales. You built an empire on the idea that people were disposable. I simply proved that one of those disposable people could be the one to dispose of you. She walked to the door. Goodbye, Julian. I hope you learn to live with being a man of no importance. I, on the other hand, am just getting started. She left him there and never looked back. The months that followed were a whirlwind. David Chen, his company saved and his reputation restored, became a fierce ally. He and Arya, along with Arthur Pym, who was given full immunity for his testimony, partnered to create a new venture. They launched a venture capital fund with a unique mission to invest in tech startups with ethical leadership, specifically seeking out founders from underrepresented backgrounds who had been overlooked by the traditional predatory VCs like Julian. Arya, once the silent wife, became the firm's public face. She was a natural. She was sharp, empathetic, and her story resonated with millions. She was no longer Arya Drake, the millionaire's wife. She was Arya Vance, the self-made woman who had taken on the establishment and won. She bought a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn, a home filled with books, light, and the smell of fresh-baked bread, all the things her old life had lacked. She was finally living in a space that felt like her own. One afternoon, sitting in her sun-drenched living room, she saw a news item online. Julian Drake had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and was sentenced to a minimum of 5 years in a federal low-security prison. The accompanying photo showed a shell of a man being led away in handcuffs. She felt nothing. No joy, no pity, no anger. He was simply a ghost from a life that was no longer hers. Her victory wasn't in his imprisonment. It was in her own liberation. It was in the quiet confidence she now wore as comfortably as a favorite sweater. It was in the purpose she found in helping others build their dreams. She had been laughed at for her weight, but she had learned her true worth had nothing to do with the numbers on a scale. It was measured in her resilience, her intelligence, and the courage it took to walk away from the ashes and build a new world from the embers. Arya's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the most observant. It's a testament to the fact that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest, but about having the patience and intelligence to make your move when it counts the most. Her journey from a place of public humiliation to one of ultimate triumph shows us that our greatest perceived weaknesses can become the source of our most formidable power. She didn't just lose the weight. She shed the toxicity, the doubt, and the man who was weighing her down. If her story of resilience and righteous victory moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more real-life dramas where the underdog finally gets their day. Thank you for watching.